Hey, it's Will from Learnerator, and in this video I'm going to walk you through the 2013 AP Microeconomics Free Response question number 2. This question is related to game theory and Nash equilibriums, so if you haven't already reviewed those concepts, be sure to review them before viewing this video and trying to solve this question. Let's go ahead and get started. The question states, there are two pizza restaurants in College Town, Pie Crust and La Pizza. Each company must decide whether to advertise or not advertise. In the payoff matrix below, the first entry in each cell indicates Pie Crust's daily profit. The second entry indicates La Pizza's daily profit. Both firms have complete information. Great. So let's think about this in the planning period and what the questions are going to be asking. Well, in this case, it looks like part A is going to be asking about strategies. So what would happen conditional on another behavior of another player. And so this is going to be asking about the strategy of one versus another. The second question is going to be about dominant behavior. The third is a Nash equilibrium question. And then the fourth, it looks like, is going to be what happens when we change some payoffs. So thinking about that and thinking about Nash equilibrium, let's first solve the game. I think that solving the game would be the best approach here because it'll help you understand how the players are going to interact. And so when you're asked these questions, you'll be able to just knock them out of the ballpark one after the other. So the way that I always solve games is I always kind of cover up what the other person is doing while thinking about what Pie Crust would do. So in other words, in the case where I want to solve for Pie Crust's situation in the advertised versus not advertised situation, I need to assess two different conditions. The first condition would be where La Pizza chooses to advertise, and then the second would be where La Pizza decides not to advertise. So in other words, imagine that this side of the payoff matrix is just gone, right? Just take your hand, cover the screen for this area. And what that means is we're going to first assess the situation in which La Pizza chooses to advertise and see what Pie Crust does. So if La Pizza chooses to advertise, then we know that the payoff matrix really changes to just be two options. Pie Crust either advertises or does not advertise, and therefore we want to compare 250 with 180. Well, we know that 250 is greater than 180. And therefore, in this situation in which La Pizza were to advertise, we know that Pie Crust would choose 250. Now let's solve the game in which La Pizza would not advertise. Well, let's imagine that this advertise is gone now, and let's go ahead and think about what happens in the case where we do not advertise. So, in this case, Pie Crust again can respond by either advertising or not advertising. The first number denotes Pie Crust's reaction, so we are in this case comparing 450 with 390. Well, we know that 450 is greater than 390. So in the case in which La Pizza were to not advertise, the best response of Pie Crust would be to advertise. So let's think about this conclusion first before we solve La Pizza's actions, because this makes sense, right? If La Pizza advertises, it may make sense for Pie Crust not to advertise because there would be a very competitive landscape. And meanwhile, if La Pizza were not to advertise, it would make sense for Pie Crust to advertise. So intuitively, this question makes sense. I don't want to say that you want to apply that rule always in terms of thinking about the core intuition, but because sometimes, a test taker could make it so that the result of the game is counterintuitive. But in this situation, it makes sense in terms of just thinking about the problem that we've been presented with. Now let's think about La Pizza's reactions and decisions to advertise or not advertise based on Pie Crust's actions. So, in this case, we're going to imagine that Pie Crust just advertises. So in other words, just look at this top portion of the payoff matrix. Okay? So now, the La Pizza, will he advertise or not advertise? Well, in this case, we're comparing 200 to 300, and we know that 300 is going to be greater than 200. And therefore, we know that La Pizza would go ahead and not advertise if Pie Crust were to advertise. Now let's think about that lower portion of the payoff matrix. in this case, we know that we are essentially assessing 500 versus 400. So if we look at 500 versus 400, we know that 500 is greater than 400. So what do we have here? Well, we know essentially that these would be the best reactions of each player to each respective strategy. And therefore, we see that we have a Nash equilibrium because we have a situation in which the action leads to a situation where where both players have no incentive to deviate. So now that we've solved the game, let's go ahead and think about the respective questions. We pretty much already solved all these questions, so it'll be pretty simple. So part A is asking about what strategy Pie Crust would choose if La Pizza chooses to advertise. Well, we went over that. If La Pizza were to choose to advertise, we'd be looking at this particular side of the payoff matrix, and we found that player 1, or Pie Crust, would go with 250. So they would choose to advertise. And your explanation here would just be that 250 is greater than 150. So it's a higher payoff for Pie Crust in the advertise versus non-advertise situation. Now, the second question asks about what is the dominant strategy, if any, for La Pizza. Explain using the dollar values in the payoff matrix. So the dominant strategy is essentially asking for if there's a situation in which one strategy is always better than another strategy, regardless of what the opponent plays. So let's think about what La Pizza does in the case in which Pie Crust advertises. In the case where Pie Crust advertises, we found that La Pizza would choose to go ahead and not advertise. And in the case in which Pie Crust did not advertise, we found that La Pizza would go ahead and advertise. And therefore, because La Pizza's actions are always reliant on Pie Crust and he changes his best responses, we have no dominant strategy. So there is no dominant strategy. And the way that I would explain this in your answer is to go ahead and state that the best choice, the best response, depends on Pie Crust. So then I would write when Pie Crust advertises, La Pizza does not advertise, and when Pie Crust does not advertise, La Pizza advertises. So that's part B. Part C, in the Nash equilibrium, determine each of the following: Pie Crust's daily profit and La Pizza's daily profit. So we already identified the Nash equilibrium. It is that top right corner, and therefore we know that the daily profit for Pie Crust is going to be the first number, which is 450. And then the daily profit for La Pizza is going to be the second number, which is 300. And then finally it says, suppose that advertising costs increase $60 per day. Redraw the payoff matrix to reflect the effect of the higher advertising costs. So in this case, we're essentially adding an additional cost of 60. And so we need to think about this in terms of profit. We know that profit is going to equal total revenue minus total cost. So we know that this is giving us the profit, the final number here, and we essentially want to take profit minus an additional 60, and that'll give us the new profit. So thinking about that, we essentially want to look at every single situation in which a player is going to advertise and then subtract 60 from that payoff for the player that advertises. So just in this lower corner, I'm going to write these two firms: advertise, do not advertise, advertise, does not. And then I'm going to draw this matrix. And then I'm going to think about this. So in the case in which both advertise, we knew that the original situation was 250 and 200. in this case, because both advertise, we want to take 60 away from both of these payoffs. And therefore, 250 minus 60 is going to be 190. And then 200 minus 60 is 140. Great, easy enough. Now let's go ahead and solve the next part of the quadrant. So in that lower left quadrant, we know that La Pizza advertises and Pie Crust does not, and therefore Pie Crust's payoff is going to remain 180 because he does not advertise, so he does not incur that additional cost, whereas La Pizza is going to be 500 minus 60, which is 440. And then finally, let's think about the right side. In this case, Pie Crust advertises, La Pizza does not, so we want to take 450 minus 60, which is going to be 390, and then La Pizza's cost or payoff profit is going to be the same at 300. And then that last one is going to be super simple because we know that both firms do not advertise. There is no change in the profit payoff. That's it. So that's pretty much parts A through D for number 2. The main thing in the solution concept here is to work through the game, understand the intuition behind the game, where the Nash equilibrium is, as well as the fact of that every single reaction of a player is based on the action of the other player, and that pretty much will help you in thinking about how a player responds to his opponent's move. So that's pretty much it for part 2 of the 2013 AP Micro free response question. If you have any other needs for practicing, feel free to check out Learnerator for hundreds of AP Micro practice questions. And aside from that, that's it for this video. In the next video, we're going to go over how to solve question number 3 for the 2013 AP Microeconomics exam. I'll see you guys next time.